Hello students, here is the narration for the respiratory system. I'm going to divide the narrations into two parts. So this narration will begin with a look at the gross anatomy, so the overall anatomy. We will work more on the anatomical features of the respiratory system, and then there is some physiology, so that will come in the second narration. So this is slides 1 to 14. So the objectives then are for you to be able to label parts of the anatomy of the entire respiratory system, to be able to understand the mechanics of breathing, the physiology involved in gas exchange, both in the lungs as well as in the tissues. Taking a closer look at some of the microscopic features. So again, the theme of how structure is suited to function, you should give some thought to this. What sort of tissues do we find throughout the respiratory system? The physiological events that occur at the alveoli, movement of the gases, and we will be talking about two processes called internal and external respiration, which actually you met in the cardiovascular system. And finally, a look at how the respiratory system works with other organ systems in the body to maintain homeostasis. So let's get started. So here is the diagram. Like I've said before, for every organ system that we're studying, there is one major diagram, which you always want to make sure you can label parts. And so this is the major diagram for the respiratory system. There is another diagram with more detail, so yes, you will need to know that. But this diagram is showing you sort of the gross anatomy, the big picture of the respiratory system. So the major respiratory system structures span the nasal cavity to the diaphragm. So that's very important to know. Here is the diaphragm, which we would have met when we did skeletal muscles. So it is the structure that separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity. So here is the abdominal cavity with the respective organs. And we can see ribs being shown here. Also, you sort of met the thoracic cavity before, and the ribs are only being shown on one side. So again, this is diagrammatic to keep the image somewhat simple. So air is actually not oxygen. Air is only 21% oxygen, and the majority of another gas is present in air, and that is nitrogen. So air enters the body through the nostrils, which you know, and it is then sent along a passageway. So much of the respiratory system structures, there actually is a passageway, and I'm just going to put a line right through here in red, until air can get to the lungs. The lungs proper, and it's not the, all of the structure in the lung. There is a structure called the alveoli. That is where gas exchange occurs. So as air enters the nasal cavity, it needs to be cleaned of debris, it needs to be humidified, and it needs to be warmed prior to getting to the lungs. So as the air is traveling through the nasal passages, it is being warmed because there are lots of blood capillaries. The nasal passage, the entire respiratory passageway is lined by mucous membrane. So the mucous membrane, is very moist, so that helps with the humidifying of the air. And underneath that membrane are lots of blood capillaries, and they help to warm the air. In the nostrils, there are hairs, actual hairs, not cilia, hairs, and these help to trap microorganisms or pollen or dust, so that the air is being clean and filtered. Here we see these sort of three structures which are in the nasal cavity. Those structures, as the air is passing through them, they have passageways. It creates a lot of turbulence, and that also helps because remember, mucus is very sticky. So dust and other particles can stick to the mucus so that the air is cleaned as it makes its way down. Now we could do a sort of passage, pathway of air. So pathway of air, we would have nostril would be first where it enters, 2 would be the nasal cavity, and then 3 would be the back of the nasal passageway, an area called the pharynx. And do not mix up the pharynx with the larynx. The larynx is the voice box, which is very prominent in males. It's often what's referred to as the Adam's apple. So that would be the passageway to the pharynx, and from the pharynx it then goes to the larynx. So you can remember pharynx as the common term used is throat, and larynx, voice box. The opening to the voice box is a structure referred to as the glottis. And then finally, so let me erase that line that I just put through there so that we can see a bit clearer. And I think I'll just grab green this time. So from the larynx, the next structure is this one. So this would be, so larynx is number 4, and 5 would be the trachea. So the trachea is always easy to recognize. The trachea is called the windpipe because it's often showed. It has C-shaped rings of cartilage. So the back of these C-shaped rings of cartilage, the opening for the letter C, the rings of cartilage, is towards the back of the body. Why? Because immediately behind the trachea is the esophagus. So the esophagus is the structure, it's a long tube that connects the pharynx, because the pharynx is shared between the respiratory system and the digestive system. And so the pharynx has a connection to the stomach. That connection is the esophagus. So since the pharynx is open to both organ systems, it means that when we swallow food, we need to make sure that the food is going to go into the esophagus and not into the windpipe. If food enters the windpipe, usually we start to cough and we would get rid of it that way. But there is an important structure, which I do believe, even though it's not labeled, it's shown here in this diagram, this structure right here. That's called the epiglottis. And the epiglottis is a flap of tissue which covers the glottis. It covers the opening, so the glottis, the opening to the voice box, which is the opening to the trachea. It covers it when we swallow food. So if you put your hand on your throat and you swallow, you'll notice 2 things. The pharynx moves upward, but also you don't take a breath at the same time. You can't do both things, swallow and take a breath at the same time. So that helps to make sure that food does not end up in the trachea. That's an important point. The trachea then branches to give us 2 structures, 2 passageways that enter the lungs. So we have a right lung and we have a left lung. The branching is these structures here, the right and left primary bronchi. So it's important that you get the names of these structures correctly so that you can understand the later discussion on this topic. Bronchi is plural, bronchus is singular. So right and left primary. Primary is the important word here. So the trachea does not enter the lungs. the trachea bifurcates, which is another word to say it branches into two. One branch going into the right lung, the other branch going into the left lung, and those are referred to respectively as bronchi or bronchus, singular. The lungs are situated in the thoracic cavity. I think you should know that now. And deep to the rib cage and intercostal muscles. Intercostal muscles are muscles which are attached to the ribs and allow the ribs to move when we breathe. The lungs are lateral to the heart, and of course they're superior to the diaphragm. And so if we look at the right lung actually has 3 lobes. So not easy to see on the diagram here. So that's the right lung that's being shown to you there. But on the left lung, you can actually see that there's a sort of a division there. And that means the left lung has 2 lobes, actually. So some space, that indentation that you see there, that's where the heart normally would actually be found, right there. So 2 major organs in the thoracic cavity, the lungs, obviously, and the heart from the cardiovascular system, but they are not the only structures. We have the parts of the trachea, and then, of course, the bronchi. Now, one of the things that you want to appreciate is this. Some textbooks may refer to the tracheobronchial tree, like as in T-R-E-E. And the reason for that is that this arrangement of the passageways is a bit like if you hold a tree upside down. So that would be the roots, right? Well, we don't have any roots here. But this would be the trunk, which would be like the trachea. And then the branches, because this is how a tree is. And then there are smaller branches. And then there are even smaller branches off those branches until you actually get to the tiniest branches where you find leaves. So that branching phenomenon is seen here, which we will take a look in a couple of slides at how that actually happens, because names are given to all these different parts, all the different branches. But this is what happens because the lungs, even though it looks here as if it's one large major structure, it is actually made up of many sort of smaller structures like this that are called alveoli. And that's where the gas exchange will occur. So as an organ system, it is important that you learn and appreciate not just the names and the location, but the more detailed anatomical features. So taking a closer look now at the structures that are in the upper respiratory tract. So which structures make up the upper respiratory tract? All of the structures from the nostril to the pharynx, the nasopharynx here, and then down to the larynx. So here's the epiglottis, which covers the glottis. Now, there's a lot of information on this slide here, and you don't have to necessarily know all of it. First of all, anything in blue is cartilage. Bone is kind of shown in this beige color, right? So separating the nasal and respiratory passageway from the oral, this is mouth here, right? From the oral cavity is the hard palate. So the hard palate is anterior, the soft palate is at the back. And you know that when you open your mouth and say, ah, you know, there's a little thing that sort of hangs down at the back of the throat. That's called the uvula. So that's what that is, the uvula. Those shelf-like structures that I was saying help to create a bit of turbulence and that they have passageways between them, they are referred to as the nasal conchae. and they increase the surface area over which the air will flow so that the air will be warmed, humidified, and cleaned. Now, I'm not sure if you remember from our study of the skeletal system, but we have sinuses. And sinuses are part of the respiratory anatomy because sinuses, while they help to lighten the weight of the skull, they actually help with voice or sound production. It's a bit like if you have a recorder and recorders have a hole and you blow through the recorder, and when you cover the different holes you make a different sound, right? A different note is played. It's a little bit like that. And if you want to know how important this is, think about how your voice sounds when you have a cold. It changes, right? And that's usually, if you have a cold, it's because there's a lot of mucus stuck in the sinuses, because sinuses are a cavity, right? An opening in the bone. It's lined with the same mucous epithelium that is lining the passageway of the respiratory system. They all have names, and they're named for the bones in which they're found. So a frontal sinus in the frontal bone. This one in this case is the sphenoidal sinus. So you just need to know sinus generally, right? And that they're there. Nasal meatus, that's the shelf-like structures that are over here, the nasal conchae. Now, we also have parts of the immune system, so lymphatic tissue, tonsils, and where they're located, they're also named. So there's pharyngeal tonsil, there's lingual tonsil, which is found under the tongue, etc. Again, just remember tonsils are lymphatic tissue that house macrophages, T cells, B cells, and they're in a very strategic location, again, because microorganisms, bacteria and viruses, can only get into the body through openings. And the nasal passageway, the respiratory system, the digestive system, the mouth, the oral cavity, well, they represent large openings that really facilitate microorganisms getting into the body. So it makes sense to have some sort of sentry, right? So these cells that live and function in the tonsils, the different locations around where the tonsils are, they are watching out for whatever might be coming in, whether it's in food or it's in the air, to help get rid of them. So there's also the palatine tonsils. Again, just generally remember tonsils. So because the pharynx is shared between three areas, the area behind the nasal passage is referred to as the nasopharynx. The area behind the oral cavity is referred to as the oropharynx. And the area that is very close to the voice box, the larynx, is referred to as the laryngopharynx. And so in this diagram here, that, right where this arrow is, that would be the esophagus. The vocal fold here, that's the opening to lead into the trachea. This here would be the trachea. So we already said that the epiglottis is an important anatomy which helps to direct air towards the larynx. More importantly, it covers the glottis to prevent food and liquids entering the larynx and trachea when we swallow. And so just to point out again, there is the epiglottis. So this this flap of tissue here comes down to cover this structure there. Shown here from superior to inferior is the epiglottis, larynx, and trachea. So epiglottis This is, now again, you see blue. This is telling you that many of these structures are made of cartilage, not bone. So cartilages all have names like this. You do not have to know all these individual names. Just appreciate that this is the trachea here with its C-shaped ring cartilage. This would be part of the voice box, the larynx, so the laryngeal prominence, which is like the Adam's apple. Okay, so we've gone through all of that already. The cartilage does help to protect the soft tissue underneath. So here's another diagram again, showing you the larynx. Remember larynx, voice box, the trachea, a tube. So the trachea has the largest diameter of all the tubes that make up the passageway that air uses to get to the alveoli. We see here the primary bronchi. They are wide, but they're not as wide as the trachea. And here's where we see the tree-like structure, the tracheobronchial tree. I think I better use red here. So the tracheobronchial tree. So you see the branching that's occurring. So all of these branches, these are still passageways. Now the trachea, so that's this here, the trachea has a very specific type of tissue called pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. And that's what's being shown here. In this is like a photomicrograph. So this is an image of the real tissue. But what it's trying to show you, see this band at the top here? That is mucus and cilia, both of them. This is the space that the air, will travel through, and these are the cells lining the passageway, like that. So the mucus is sticky, so dust, debris can stick to it, and the cilia, they beat usually in the opposite direction. So if I were to draw this structure here, or let's use this one, here, air is coming down in this direction. The cilia are present on the inside of the trachea. The cilia waft or move in the opposite direction out. So the reason they do that is they move the mucus with the trapped dust particles upwards. So when we sort of clear our throat like this, we do something like that. What we're trying to do is move that mucus up out of the respiratory passageway. We can move it into the oral cavity. We can swallow it, because if it goes to the stomach, we have hydrochloric acid, which will kill any bacteria that's on it. Or we can just spit it out. But when we smoke, we basically damage, we kill off the cilia, okay? So when the cilia is damaged, then all that mucus gets stuck in the respiratory passageway right there in the trachea. There's no wafting happening. So people who smoke over time, one of the first symptoms that you can see with regards to this damage is they get smoker's cough. What smoker's cough is the mucus is trapped in there, it's irritating the passageway, and they cough repeatedly until eventually they can get the mucus out. That's just one of the bad effects of smoking. There are several more. So cilia is very important in helping to keep the air clean. Now here's another diagram of the lungs. So the macroscopic anatomy of the lungs, showing, now we're going to get more into, we've already talked about the trachea. So let's talk about the bronchi. So here we see the word bronchus, because bronchus is singular. So main or primary bronchus. And then we have branches, and these branches have names. So each bronchus will divide further into smaller and smaller passageways, ending in bronchioles. So bronchioles are the smallest of the passageways. Bronchioles are within the lungs and are kept open not by cartilage but by smooth muscle and elastic fibers. This is important because remember, if you're in the lung, the air is in the lung has to expand and contract, right? It enlarges when we breathe in and it deflates when the air leaves. This constant movement, if we have the tissue of the alveoli, the tissue of the alveoli is one cell layer thick. It is simple squamous epithelium. It is the thinnest cell present in the human body. So if that cell had to continuously rub against cartilage, right, we usually breathe about, I don't know, 15 inhalations per minute, something like that. Think of all the friction that would be going on there and damage. So to prevent that, these small passageways, the bronchioles, they're kept open because they have to be kept open, right? You don't want them collapsing and then the air can't pass or flow. So they're kept open by the use of smooth muscle. So not cardiac muscle, not skeletal muscle, smooth muscle. And with the smooth muscle, there are some elastic protein fibers to give it flexibility, right? Okay, so back again. So now we see here in this diagram